The voice came up through the soles of my boots, not around me, not across the ridge, under me. It pushed through packed earth and flat shale and the wet root tangle under the leaf mold, rising in a low tremor that rattled my arches and set my teeth on edge. Rain had passed an hour earlier, and the air still carried that metallic tang I remembered from childhood, the smell the mountains got when stone had been struck somewhere out of sight. Everything else was dead still. No insects, no wind, not even the soft hiss of water moving through laurel, just pressure sitting hard against my eardrums. Then I heard my name, Abram. My own voice said it, not the voice I had then, standing there as a grown man with mud drying on my cuffs and a survey case hanging from one shoulder. It was the voice I had at 10 years old, thin, breathless, half a swallow still caught in the throat. It came from below my boots and said my name the way I'd used to answer when my father called from the porch. Then it repeated something else word for word, a sentence I'd said on that ridge as a child when I thought nobody was close enough to hear me. I hate the quiet up here. The ground vibrated again, not a quake, not a shift. It felt like a speaker cone under too much strain trying to force language through dirt and stone. Then my child voice said very clearly something I had never said in my life. You came back before it was ready. I don't mind admitting that my first thought wasn't fear. It was a colder thing than fear. It was recognition with no place to put itself. Whoever made those rules had already heard the mountain say worse than that. And that was 4 days after I came back to Wise County. I hadn't planned on staying longer than a week. The assignment looked simple on paper. A property line dispute north of town, 2 adjoining parcels with old survey pins that no longer matched the deed overlays. Nothing unusual about that in the mountains. Creeks shifted, trees went down. Fence lines wandered with the memory of men who'd put them up. Give a ridge enough time and enough rain, and paper started arguing with ground. I worked those kinds of disputes for a living. That's why the firm sent me. I knew the terrain, knew how mountain land lied to people, and I had the extra advantage of having grown up on the Virginia side before leaving and staying gone long enough to think distance had cured me of the old habits. It hadn't. And the first thing I noticed when I parked at the edge of the tract was the silence. Not peace. Silence. The wrong kind. The woods above Wise County were never truly quiet when I was a boy. Even in winter, there was always some small mechanical life in them. The dry click of insects under bark, a bird making one irritated sound before settling, wind moving high through oak limbs you couldn't see from the ground. But that afternoon, the ridge held itself like a chest waiting not to breathe. The wet smell after rain had iron in it. I stood there with my truck ticking as it cooled, and for one foolish second I had the feeling that the mountain had heard me arrive and was listening for what I'd do next. That detail seemed minor then. I've thought about it every day since. And the parcels I was sent to check sat under a line of old ridgeland that local people had always treated carefully without ever putting words to why. When I was little, nobody gave explanations. They gave rules. Not written ones, spoken ones, passed over supper tables and on porches and in truck cabs, always in the same plain tone people use when they're telling you not to lean back in a rotten chair because it's not a matter of belief, it's a matter of what happens next. Do not speak out loud after sunset if you are alone on the ridge. If you hear your name called from below, you keep walking. Never answer anything that repeats you. Do not dig deeper than you can hear yourself breathe. If the ground hums, you leave before it learns your voice. When I was young, I filed those rules alongside every other bit of mountain caution that had grown out of injury and weather and memory. Stay off shale when it's slick. Don't trust a creek after sudden rain. If dogs go silent all at once, come inside. I never thought of them as anything more than inherited superstition with good survival instincts hidden inside it. Country people often wrapped practical warnings in language that sounded strange to outsiders. That's what I believed when I left. That's what I believed when I came back. Then Odessa May Kettering saw me unloading the tripod. I hadn't expected her to still be living in the same house, tucked just off the lower road where the ridge bent east. The porch leaned harder than I remembered. The yard smelled of wet clay and wood rot. Odessa May Kettering stood at the gate with one hand on the latch, watching me the way she used to watch thunderstorms, not startled, not interested, just measuring distance. She had been old when I was a boy, and somehow she had crossed over into that age where years stopped mattering because the face settled into something the weather couldn't improve or ruin. Her eyes were pale and steady. Her apron was clean. Her boots were muddy to the ankle. "You've got county men poking holes again," she said. I told her I wasn't county. I explained the deed conflict, the mismatched pins, the reason I needed to verify a baseline along the ridge and down toward the old mine road. I kept my tone professional. Light. I think I smiled. Odessa May Kettering didn't. "Paper always wants the mountain to sit still," she said. "It never has." There was that metallic smell again, be stronger now that the clouds had thinned and the rocks were warming. I asked if she knew of any old markers farther upslope. She looked at the case in my hand instead of my face. "Depends how hard you're planning to ask the ground." I laughed then because I thought she wanted to scare me a little for coming back as an outsider with instruments and maps. "I'm only waking lawyers," I said. Her gaze lifted to me at that. Flat, unblinking. "Don't wake the ground, Abram Silas Treadwell." She said my full name the way people do when they are placing you inside an older version of yourself. I asked her what she meant, and she just shook her head once, as if the answer had already been offered and refused. The work itself gave me something solid to hold. I set control points. I checked line of sight, and I marked probable drift on 2 surviving pins and logged the slope variance where a retaining wall had slumped years earlier. Late summer damp clung low under the trees, and every boot step released the green smell of bruised fern and wet leaves. With a total station and decent notes, the ridge became numbers again. Angles, elevation, human scale. That steadied me, until I found the first sign that the numbers weren't the thing I should have been watching. At one point, near a saddle where the ground flattened before dropping toward an overgrown cut, I stamped my right boot to settle it on a slick patch of stone. Before my heel touched, I heard the sound of the impact, a crisp scuff. A thump. Exactly the sound my boot was about to make. Then half a beat later, I made it. I stopped with cold air in my lungs and waited, when the stillness around me thickened. I told myself I had mistaken a drip from a branch or a pebble rolling under moss for the footfall I expected to hear. Anticipation could do that. The brain was a prediction engine long before geology ever tried the same trick. So I took one slow step forward. Again, the sound came first. Scuff, then step, not an echo. The shape was wrong. Echoes decayed. They softened. This was clean, immediate, and impossible in a very precise way that made the back of my neck tighten. I spent another minute testing it. I shifted my weight without moving. No sound. I tapped my range pole against stone. Normal return. I cleared my throat. Nothing odd. Then I took another step, deliberate this time, and the ridge gave me the noise of it a fraction early, and as if the mountain had seen what my body was about to do and answered in advance. That was the moment I should have packed up and driven back down the road. Instead, I wrote it in my field notebook as an acoustic anomaly and kept working. Because once you've spent enough years solving material problems, your first instinct is always to reduce wrongness into a category that has edges. By By sunset, I had enough inconsistency in the baseline to justify another day on site. Enough, too, to convince myself I hadn't imagined the anticipatory footfalls. I wanted a second set of ears. That meant Hollis Wade Bracken. Hollis Wade Bracken handled adjoining tracks for another office and knew more about subsurface distortion than anyone in the county who didn't hold a mining permit. And he arrived the next morning with a transit case in the truck bed and that dry limestone dust smell men carry after years around cut earth and concrete. Hollis Wade Bracken had the broad, patient face of someone who trusted instruments more than stories. I liked him immediately for that. We walked the line together and I showed him the displaced pins, the drainage shift, the odd reverberation under the saddle. He listened, kneeling once to put his palm flat on the damp soil. "Old chambers," he said after a while. "Maybe caved work from before the maps got cleaned up. Sound can do ugly things in folded ground." That was the first answer that felt like an answer. It was also the wrong question. I didn't know that yet. We stayed until the light turned thin and gray and the trees began to hold shadow in their forks. When I looked up, Odessa May Kettering was standing far off near the lower break in the ridge, small between trunks, watching us in perfect stillness. The air had gone so quiet I could hear my own breathing in the cold damp under the leaves. And under that, just for a second, I felt a hum in the ground that matched it. The next morning I went up alone before sunrise because I wanted clean conditions and I didn't want Odessa May Kettering looking over my shoulder. Mist sat low in the hollows, and the soil held that after-rain chill that rises into your boot leather and stays there. The ridge hadn't found its birds yet. No calls, no wing noise, just the faint wet tick of condensation slipping off rhododendron leaves. I set a line of flagged points across the saddle and started the simplest test I could think of, 1 step every 5 seconds, same cadence, in same direction, listening hard enough that my jaw ached. The sound still came before the movement, once might have been imagination. Repetition turned it into evidence. Every time I lifted a boot, the mountain gave me the footfall a breath early. Not from ahead, not behind, underneath. Slightly to the left at first, then directly below me when I moved toward the center of the flat. I checked for hollow ground with the pole. I listened for water flow. I even crouched and laid my ear against a broad seam of exposed stone slick with moss. The rock was cold enough to sting my skin. From inside it came the faintest layered murmur, too low for words, like many voices trying not to wake someone. I noted direction, delay, and probable source depth. Clinical, useful. I had to keep treating it that way. And because the alternative was to remember being a child on a porch in the same county, hearing older people tell me not to answer anything that repeated me, and realizing I had reached the age where those sentences stopped sounding quaint. I ran another test with speech. 1 word. Neutral. Marker. The ridge took the word and threw back a warped version from downslope. Normal enough. Then before I said the second word, I heard it. Marker. It came from below my boots in my own voice, a shade flatter than the original, as if the mouth making it had learned the shape, but not the habit. I didn't speak again for a while after that. I switched to hand notes and instrument clicks. I moved methodically from point to point, feeling the low pressure in the air build as the sun climbed. By midday, the clouds burned off and the smell changed from wet leaves to warm rock and old metal. I should have felt more comfortable in daylight. Instead, the woods seemed stripped, too visible. No movement in the understory, no insect drift. The stillness wasn't empty. It was occupied. At the center flag, I performed the test that should have ended the job. I stood with 1 boot on shale and 1 on packed dirt and silently thought the word left. I did not whisper it. I didn't shape it with my mouth. I only thought it because part of me had started suspecting that whatever I was dealing with might be riding anticipation instead of sound, and I wanted to prove my own nerves were doing the rest. From under the shale, very faintly, I heard my own voice say, "Il left." The inside of my mouth went dry so fast it felt like all the moisture had been pulled out through my teeth. I stayed still. The hum under the ground deepened for half a second and then faded, like something testing a tuning fork and deciding not to strike harder. That sound has bothered me more than anything else I heard on the ridge. Not the loud things, not the voices that came later. That one thought made audible. Because if I had somehow breathed it, or mouthed it, or given it away through some tiny involuntary motion, then the world still made sense. If I hadn't, then the mountain had either learned me well enough to get there first, or it was closer to me than speech had ever been. At the time, I called it contamination of the test conditions. That's the phrase I wrote. I can still see the graphite mark where my hand shook halfway through the word contamination. I took the notebook and the data down to Hollis Wade Bracken that afternoon. His office occupied the converted front room of a cinder block building that smelled like dust. Coffee gone stale in a warming plate and printer heat. I spread the pages between us and walked him through each anomaly. Hollis Wade Bracken listened without interrupting, elbows on the desk, reading my notes twice before he looked up. "You want the boring answer or the one that'll keep you up?" he asked. "The boring one." He tapped the page where I had written anticipatory footfall. Complex echo paths, buried voids, pressure gradients after rain, low-frequency conduction through stone. You've got old workings or natural chambers under that ridge, Ida, and you're hearing sound reach one place faster than your brain expects. That happens. Not like this maybe, but sound does ugly things underground. And the word I didn't say. Hollis Wade Bracken leaned back, chair creaking. "That part I think you did say. Or almost said. People make more noise than they know." It was sensible. It was probably the answer I would have given someone else. So I asked him to come up and help me verify a source. He did not hesitate. Skepticism made him useful. We reached the saddle near late afternoon when the air had gone heavy enough that the collar of my shirt stuck to my neck. That metallic scent was back, stronger than before. Hollis Wade Bracken set down a hammer and a compact geophone rig. We worked in near silence for an hour, placing sensors, striking test points, logging returns, and the readings were strange but not impossible. Multiple cavities, irregular depth, some long, some narrow. A folded network that didn't match the old mine maps I had seen in the county archive before driving out. Then my rod tip punched through a sheet of rotted planks hidden under leaf litter. The ground crusted over it gave way with a soft, splintering sigh, not a crash, and cold air breathed up through the hole onto my hands. It smelled like wet limestone and long-sealed metal. We cleared the debris carefully, crouched side by side in the fern stink and the damp loam, and found the edge of a shaft collar collapsed inward years ago, maybe decades. No signage, no entry on any official record I'd been given. The timbers had blackened with age. Moss grew over old tool scoring. When I shone my light down, the beam found maybe 12 feet of broken cribbing and then vanished into angled dark. Hollis Wade Bracken whistled softly. Not fear, calculation. "That," he said, "might explain your line drift. We should have reported the unrecorded opening and left it for a crew with proper safety gear. That's what the manual would have said. Instead, we rigged a line, checked air with what we had, and descended far enough to see whether the void connected under the disputed parcels. I told myself the information would save a return trip. That's another lie competence tells when it wants to continue. Inside, the temperature dropped at once. The walls sweated cold. Water ticked from the roof in patient intervals, and each drop gave back a different shape of sound depending on where it landed. Stone, mud, standing water, old wood, At first, it was only acoustically interesting. Then Hollis Wade Bracken stopped with his light raised and said, "Do you hear that?" I did. Voices. Not one. Many. They were low and overlapping, as if several conversations occupied the same narrow chamber and none of the speakers had been taught to take turns. Some words were clear and local, the rounded mountain vowels I grew up around. Others sounded older, clipped, worn down, spoken by mouths that expected harder labor and less rest. A woman saying, "Come inside before dark." A man muttering about timbers. Someone laughing once, then coughing. A child asking a question I couldn't make out. None of it seemed directed at us. It moved through the chamber in layers, catching on the wet walls and passing on. I called out, "Hello?" The voices didn't stop. They bent. For a second, they arranged themselves around that word, as if the chamber had to decide where to file it. Then somewhere below us, in a tone too close to my own, something said, "Hello." Hollis Wade Bracken swore under his breath and angled his light down the passage. There was nothing there but stone throat and a deeper dark beyond it. He recovered faster than I did. "Acoustic memory," he said, but he was forcing the phrase now. "Places hold patterns. Certain caves do it. You get standing waves, delayed returns, trapped reflection. From voices decades apart. Maybe, if the conditions cycle." That was the first time I heard Hollis Wade Bracken argue with his own certainty. It wasn't enough to make him superstitious. It was enough to keep him from calling me mistaken. We backed out before dusk, and neither of us said much climbing to the surface. The woods above the shaft felt even more unnatural after the chamber, as if the silence outside was less honest than the crowded sound below. Odessa May Kettering was waiting near the tree line with her hands folded into her apron, the damp air silvering her hair. "You found it," she said. Hollis Wade Bracken turned to her. "How long have you known that shaft was there?" Odessa May Kettering looked at him, then passed him to me. "Long enough." "Why wasn't it ever reported?" Her face didn't change. "Because paper invites digging." It should have sounded evasive. Instead, it sounded rehearsed, protective, like a line that had been spoken for years not to conceal a shame, but to maintain a boundary. Hollis Wade Bracken asked her one more thing then. And I remember the feel of the cooling air on my wrists because the question changed the shape of the whole job. "Who taught you those rules?" Odessa May Kettering didn't answer. She only looked at the hole in the ridge and said very softly, "People who heard themselves come back wrong." That night I lay in a rented room above town with the windows cracked to let in cool air and could not stop hearing the chamber sorting my hello. By morning I wasn't trying to settle a boundary line anymore. I was building a case. The rain held off for 2 days, and that gave me the stable ground conditions I needed to stop treating the ridge like folklore and start measuring it like a system. I brought in the portable seismic kit from the truck and laid out a broader grid than the original assignment justified, geophones along the saddle, additional pickups down the eastern face where the old mine road had sagged. Source points marked with paint tabs on stone. Hollis Wade Bracken joined me with the resigned look of a man who had told himself he was satisfying professional curiosity, and found that curiosity was the least of it. By then the mountain had developed a smell I associated only with that place, not just wet rock or iron after rain. Something sharper underneath, like pennies rubbed between cold fingers, like a struck rail line cooling in evening air. The stillness persisted. Sometimes I would catch myself waiting for a gust and realize minutes had passed without a leaf turning. The data, once enough of it existed, became impossible to ignore. Subsurface returns showed chamber after chamber, some natural karst spaces widened by fracture, These others long runnels of resonance that didn't behave like water channels or conventional mine works. They interlocked beneath the ridgelines in a pattern too broad to belong to a single tract. We traced probable voids under the disputed parcels first, then under adjoining land, then beyond that. Hollis Wade Bracken spread the overlays on the hood of my truck while I transferred points and the map kept growing. The cavities ran north and south under multiple properties, then beneath the county line itself, then farther still. Not isolated pockets, a network, a folded lattice of stone chambers and narrow throats spanning miles. Scale is a cold kind of horror. It doesn't hit you in the chest, it empties something behind your eyes. And I remember looking down at the map and feeling the same sensation I used to get as a child, when I stood at the edge of a flooded creek and realized the water touching my boot wasn't local anymore. It connected to distances I couldn't picture. The ridge under my assignment was not a singular oddity. It was one mouth in a buried instrument that stretched across counties. Hollis Wade Bracken ran a hand over the paper and said, "This should not be here." He meant the extent of it, the organization. Natural chambers happen. Old mine works happen. Even strange acoustics happen. But this amount of contiguous resonant space with pathways that seemed to favor transmission over collapse meant we were looking at something older and more stable than the county records, maybe older than settlement as such. And I started pulling archived mine plats and geological surveys that afternoon. None of them accounted for more than a fraction of what our reading suggested. The official maps had blankness where the mountain had architecture. I didn't understand what I was looking at yet. I only knew it was built to keep sound alive. That afternoon, we tested the chambers more aggressively. Controlled taps, short-spoken phrases, recorded tones at different frequencies. The response patterns were not random. Some cavities amplified low resonance and buried speech. Others preserved consonants so cleanly that a word could come back at you with more edge than you gave it. There were time delays too long to make intuitive sense, responses arriving minutes after their source, then returning again hours later from a different direction. Hollis Wade Bracken called it redistribution. I called it storage in my notes before crossing the word out and writing temporary retention. Even then, I could feel the language trying to run ahead of the evidence. Late in the day, when the sun had shifted enough to cast the saddle in shadow while the upper ridge still held light, I stood on a marked point and said into a ground microphone, "Test phrase 1. Abram Silas Treadwell, North Line, clear conditions." The headphones carried back not just my voice, but versions of it refracted through different chambers. Near, far, thinned, thickened. One line repeated correctly from somewhere downslope after 6 seconds. Another came back from the east a full minute later, flattened into something almost mechanical. Then, under both of them, softer than a whisper, I heard my own voice say, "Clear conditions, Abram." I did not say that line. I pulled the headset off and looked at Hollis Wade Bracken. He had heard it through the external monitor, too. He didn't try to explain it immediately. That frightened me more than the sentence. "What if it's combining source fragments?" he said after a while. But he said it to the map, not to me. Taking what it has and rearranging it through interference. Acoustics don't rearrange address. "No," he said, "not acoustics." We spent the next hour checking cabling and eliminating equipment contamination, because that was easier than admitting the alternative. The gear was clean. The phrase remained in the recording, faint but undeniable. On the drive down, we stopped at Odessa May Kettering's gate without discussing it first. The evening had gone cold in that sudden mountain way, and the smell of damp stone hung low near the ditch. Odessa May Kettering was shelling beans on the porch as if she had expected us. Hollis Wade Bracken laid one of the overlays on her table. "How much of this do you know about?" She didn't look at the paper. Enough. It runs under more than your ridge. I know. How? That was when she finally lifted her eyes. Because it's always been there. You all just call things discovered when you finally draw them. Hollis Wade Bracken pressed his palm to the map. If people knew this was underneath them, there would have been reports, collapses, notes, warnings. There were warnings. Odessa May Kettering snapped a bean clean in two. You boys just wanted them written in a language you respected. I should have been irritated. Instead, I felt shame prickle under the back of my collar, and because part of me understood she was right. We had dismissed oral rule as superstition because it lacked the formatting we associate with seriousness. But those 5 rules I grew up hearing did the work of a technical manual written by people who had no interest in convincing outsiders. They weren't trying to explain the mountain. They were trying to starve it. I still hadn't reached that conclusion. I was close enough to feel its heat. That night, I spread my notes across the motel bed and built timelines, source paths, chamber relationships, possible frequencies of retention. If the network redistributed sound through pressure shifts and resonance cycles, then it might preserve input in phases. Maybe some chambers favored recent speech and others held older material until conditions matched. Maybe rain, temperature, and barometric pressure acted like a clock. I was asking how the mountain remembered. I should have been asking what memory meant to it. Odessa May Kettering came to the ridge before dawn on the 5th day. I heard her boots in the leaf litter before I saw her, a careful double crunch. Then the smell of cold coffee and wood smoke from her coat as she stepped through the gray light. The woods had gone so still that morning the mist seemed pinned in place between the trunks. Even my own breathing sounded intrusive. "I told you not to wake it," she said. I was kneeling over a line of sensors, hands numb from the cold. "Then tell me what it is." Odessa May Kettering looked past me toward the saddle where the hidden shaft waited under rotted boards and fern. You won't like the answer now any more than you would have as a boy. As a boy, I wasn't expected to understand. "No," she said. "You were expected to obey." There was no offense in it, just fact. That made it harder to resist. I stood, brushed damp dirt from my palms, and asked her again. This time she didn't refuse, not exactly. She told me the rules had been old when she first heard them, older than her mother and older than the first mine families. People passed them because people who ignored them disappeared in ways the mountain did not explain cleanly. Not blood, not wreckage, not even bodies half the time. What came back was voice, manner, habit, sometimes years later. Sometimes all at once after a hard rain. She said the first ones to understand hadn't been scholars or officials. They were people who lived close enough to ridgelines to notice that the ground sometimes gave back a person in pieces long after the person was gone. A laugh, a phrase, a cough, a way of clearing the throat. Enough pieces over enough seasons and somebody realized the mountain wasn't haunted in the way stories claimed. It was keeping people, Odessa May Kettering said. The words settled in the cold air between us. I heard water tap from a branch behind her shoulder. I smelled that same struck stone tang rising even though it had not rained since yesterday. Hollis Wade Bracken asked who taught you the rules, I said. You never answered. Odessa May Kettering nodded once. The people who lost enough kin to patterns, that's who. Men went into cuts and heard wives speaking from under the rock while those wives were home hanging wash. Children answered their own names and walked off ridges at dusk. Folks learned quick what silence was worth. Then why stay here? At that, something like pity crossed her face. Because leaving doesn't make it forget. That was the first sentence she gave me that felt larger than the ridge. It opened a dimension I hadn't wanted to consider. If the system preserved voice and behavior, then geography might not be the limit of its reach. I pushed back instinctively. "It's stone," I said. "Stone doesn't follow." Odessa May Kettering bent, picked up one of my marker flags and turned it between finger and thumb. "No, but people do. Voices do. Habit does. Young, you carry more of a place than your truck bed shows." Then Hollis Wade Bracken arrived from the lower track and found the two of us standing in the motionless woods with the mist clinging to our knees. He carried a binder of copied plats under one arm and smelled faintly of diesel and cold paper. His eyes moved from Odessa May Kettering to me and back. "I found partial records of an old collapse line that shouldn't connect to any of this," he said. "Nothing official. Margin notes mostly. Mentions of hearing crews after they'd gone home." Odessa May Kettering's face shut like a door. Hollis Wade Bracken saw it. "What happened the first time your people understood what this was?" She did not answer. He tried again. "Was there one event, one collapse, one flood? Something that made the rules stick?" Odessa May Kettering set the marker flag back in my kit with care that looked almost ceremonial. "If I tell you where the rules came from, you'll treat it like origin, like story. That isn't what matters." "What matters then?" She looked straight at me when she said it. "That you're feeding it." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her speech tests and seismic taps were not communion. But every experiment I had run involved sound. Every effort to understand the network required introducing more of myself into it. My voice, my pacing, my questions, even my breathing over an open shaft. Hollis Wade Bracken shifted the binder under his arm. "If the thing under this ridge can retain human sound for years, that's not superstition. That's a geological phenomenon." Odessa May Kettering gave him a hard little smile. "That's the safest name you can think of for it." Then she left us in the cold pressure of the trees. For the rest of that day, Hollis Wade Bracken and I worked with a new caution neither of us admitted aloud. We spoke less, used hand signals when we could, logged times and conditions without commentary. The fewer words we gave the ridge, the more I became aware of other noises. The sticky release of my boot from mud, the dry brush of a sleeve over bark, the little whistle the geophone cable made in my hand when I pulled it straight. Everything felt available to the mountain. Late that evening, when the light was almost gone and the first rule ought to have sent me down the road, we heard it from the shaft. A conversation, not random overlap, not fragments tumbling past each other. A conversation between two men discussing a line placement error from 20 years earlier, one of them cursing under his breath in the exact phrasing a retired surveyor I had apprenticed under used when a rod wasn't plumb. He had been dead for 6 years. I knew the cadence of his annoyance. Then woven under it, I heard my own voice at 12 complaining about mud in my shoes. Not memory, not resemblance, source material. Hollis Wade Bracken stared into the dark opening and whispered, "It's organizing them." I didn't correct him for speaking. Neither of us could pretend the rules were quaint after that. By the 6th day, the mountain had started answering in sequence. I don't mean simple repeats. I don't mean delayed echoes that happen to line up into something suggestive. I mean I would hear a phrase from below. Wait, hear it again from another chamber with one word altered. Then a third time with a different ending, as if the buried network were trying versions against one another. The air had warmed after noon and turned heavy enough to taste. Every breath brought in damp fern, rusted mineral, and that singed metallic edge that had become the signature smell of the ridge. When the hum moved through the ground, I felt it first in my molars. I stopped making deliberate speech tests. It no longer mattered. The system had enough of me already. That morning, while checking a sensor array near the old shaft, I heard a woman's voice say, Come inside before dark. It came from below and to the east, softened by distance. I knew it at once. It belonged to my childhood, into evenings when the porch light came on and somebody older than me was tired of yelling uphill. Before I could react, the chamber gave it back from a second direction. Come inside before he learns you're dark. The altered word landed wrong in my body. Not because it was threatening in a theatrical way, because it wasn't. It sounded like a machine correcting grammar without understanding meaning, preserving cadence while testing substitution. The mountain had the rhythm of a remembered warning and was trying new nouns inside it. I wrote the phrase down and told myself to remain descriptive. Then another voice rose under it, a cracked older man's tone I had heard only in family recordings, saying, "Leave the ridge be." A second return followed, "Leave the ridge breathing." Then a third in no voice I recognized at all, "I'll leave the ridge hearing." Hollis Wade Bracken heard those too. He had gone pale by the time the third version came back, but even then he wanted to frame it as process. Variation through resonance pressure, he said. Maybe certain phonemes are getting replaced by similar frequencies. Phonemes don't choose a sentence that still makes sense. He looked at the shaft and did not answer. The worst part was how ordinary my own body tried to remain. I tightened bolts, checked levels, wiped mud off a case. Professional motion continued because stopping would have meant admitting there was no known category left. Fear showed up instead in what I noticed. The temperature change near cracks in the rock. The way the hum thickened whenever I stood still too long over one chamber throat. The faint drag of air at ankle height, moving uphill when it should have settled down. At one point, I crouched beside an exposed slab and heard two overlapping conversations below me. One sounded like a pair of men discussing powder charges in clipped, practical tones. The other was much newer, a teenager laughing about a truck stuck in spring mud. Decades separated them. Stone held both. Then both strands bent around the same borrowed phrase in my voice. "Can you hear me?" I had not said that sentence anywhere on the ridge. Not then, not earlier in the week. I knew because I had been careful with my wording once the responses turned strange. Yet there it was, my own voice inserted between the dead and the living, testing a direct address. The mountain was no longer merely replaying human presence. It was aligning it, looking back, and that was the last moment I could have walked away and remained only myself. Instead, I went deeper into the evidence. Hollis Wade Bracken and I reviewed recordings in his office until the room smelled like overheated equipment and coffee turned bitter on the hot plate. On clean playback, the alterations were undeniable. Not random drift, patterned substitution, syntax preserved, speaker qualities retained with unsettling accuracy. We isolated several phrases and compared returns across different times of day. The network favored certain words when pressure dropped. Different chambers emphasized different replacements. It was as if each section of the system contributed one small tendency, and together those tendencies produced sentence variants. "Storage isn't enough to explain this," I said. Hollis Wade Bracken rubbed at the bridge of his nose. "No." "Then what are we measuring?" He sat with that for a long time, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, his jaw set tight. "Behavior," he said finally. "Maybe not language in the way we mean it, but behavior, inputs, recurrence, likelihood." It sounded absurd. It also fit better than anything else we had. I took that thought back to Odessa May Kettering at dusk. She stood in her yard under a sky the color of wet slate, shelling another pan of beans as if the world had not shifted around us. The smell of turned soil and cold ash hung near the porch. I told her what we had heard, how the phrases were changing, how old voices and new ones were being blended into fresh responses. She listened without surprise. "It's trying your edges," she said. "My edges. What you say, even what you mean, what comes next when you start a thought. It's been doing that longer than you've been alive. Then it isn't memory? No. Odessa May Kettering looked toward the dark ridge. Memory is what people call it when a thing keeps the dead still. That isn't what this does. I asked her why she hadn't left when she first understood. This time she answered in a way that frightened me more than any replay. Because I wanted to hear what it would make of us in the end. There it was. Faith stripped of ritual, not worship. Devotion to continuation. Odessa May Kettering did not fear the system because she believed her life belonged inside it in some form, not body, pattern. I wish I could say I left then. I didn't. The next day, the ground started using my voice to speak ahead of me. It happened just after noon, and when the clouds had built up high and the air pressed down hard enough to dull distant sound. Hollis Wade Bracken and I were back on the ridge with a reduced setup, fewer sensors, more caution. We spoke only when necessary. The shaft stood open now, cleared and braced enough for one careful descent if we chose it. The woods around us seemed thinner every day, as if ordinary sound had been withdrawn from them and the remaining silence had a shape. I bent to adjust a lead near the saddle and heard from below my boots, "You're too late." My own voice, adult now, not the child tone from the cold open, my current voice tired and dry and exact. I froze. Hollis Wade Bracken looked up from 20 feet away. "What?" Before I could answer, the ground said in my voice again, "No, not yet." The second phrase was gentler, thinking aloud, a testing contradiction. I did not say either sentence. A hum spread through the soil under us, low enough to feel more than hear. It moved under the ridge like distant machinery coming online, only there was nothing mechanical about its timing. It swelled when I shifted my weight, faded when I stilled. I dropped to one knee and pressed my palm to the ground. The vibration ran through my hand and into my wrist bones. Then I did the strangest thing I have ever done in my life. I held my breath. The hum stopped, not gradually, not by diminishing into the background. It ceased so abruptly that the absence of it made the woods tilt for a second. Hollis Wade Bracken heard the cutoff too. His eyes widened in a way I had not seen before because he knew as well as I did what that implied. The system was not only sensitive to voiced sound, it was reading respiration, cadence, presence measured through pressure itself. When I breathed again, shallow and unwilling, the hum resumed at once. That tightened something inside me I could not loosen. If the mountain tracked breath, then the old rule about digging no deeper than you could hear yourself breathe was not picturesque caution. It was a threshold condition. Once your own respiration disappeared into the system's body, you no longer had a clean boundary between yourself and it. Hollis Wade Bracken approached slowly, boots crunching on damp grit. "Say nothing," he murmured. I nodded. The ground beneath us in my voice said, "Say nothing." Then after a pause, carefully measured to match my own habits, "That helps." Hollis Wade Bracken backed away from the saddle as if the earth there had become thin ice. We gathered equipment without speaking. Every metallic snap of a latch, every rasp of cable over bark seemed to draw faint internal answers from below. Not enough words to track. Just the sense of something rehearsing around us. When we reached Odessa May Kettering's porch, both of us were carrying the smell of wet stone and panic. She took one look at my face and said, "It's got your stride now." I don't know why that sentence hit harder than everything else. Maybe because pace is more intimate than voice. It meant the system wasn't just building phrases from what I had given it. It was learning the order in which I moved through choices. Hollis Wade Bracken asked her the question I had stopped wanting answered. What happens when it learns enough? Odessa May Kettering set down her bowl. It depends what you call enough. Has it happened before? She folded her hands, the skin on them mapped with age and work. People used to think the danger was being lured, called by the wrong voice, taken by a fall. Some of that happened, mostly because people are foolish around anything that sounds like grief speaking back. But the worst of it wasn't that. The worst was hearing someone before they said themselves. A pressure headache had begun behind my left eye. I stood in her yard listening to the insects not sing and understood that the mountain had crossed some line with me I could not uncross. "It's predicting," Hollis Wade Bracken said. Odessa May Kettering looked at him, then at me. "If that comforts you, keep using that word." Comfort was gone by then. So was the illusion that this investigation was about documenting an unusual acoustic network. We were standing at the edge of a buried system that could retain, compare, and extend human patterns through stone. The wrong question had been how it stored us. The right one was what it was making. I barely slept that night. Every settling pipe in the motel sounded like a throat clearing under floorboards. I left before dawn and drove the long road that curved away from the ridge and then back toward it from the far side, trying to think outside the pattern the mountain had learned from my usual approach. The sky was clear for once. The cold had sharpened. Gravel popped under the tires with glassy little sounds. When I stepped out, the stillness met me again, clean and total, and the air smelled of frost over iron. I didn't go to the shaft first. I went to the high point above the map chambers and sat with my notes spread on the hood, tracing timelines with a pencil nub until the logic finally aligned. Retention across decades, redistribution according to pressure shifts. Voice variance increasing with exposure. Behavioral mimicry linked to breath cadence and repeated presence. What I had treated as anomaly, then storage, then adaptation, formed a clearer shape when taken together. The mountain was not preserving sound the way a cave preserves drip marks or a cut wall preserves tool scratches. It was cataloging recurrence. Human voices entered the network as patterned events. Over years, maybe centuries, the chambers compared them, redistributed them, compressed them into likely continuations. Not replay, refinement. And I said that word aloud to test it, and hated the way the ridge below seemed to absorb it with interest. Refinement. If the system had been doing this since before formal settlement, then it had recorded generations of speech, response, caution, grief, labor, argument, tenderness, fear. Enough data to model what humans sound like under pressure, what they say in the dark, what warning becomes when repeated across bloodlines. The old rules suddenly made technical sense. Do not speak out loud after sunset if you are alone on the ridge, because isolated speech is clean input. If you hear your name called from below, keep walking because response confirms alignment. Never answer anything that repeats you because repetition is a probe. Do not dig deeper than you can hear yourself breathe. Because respiration marks the point where the system's resonance overtakes your self-monitoring. If the ground hums, leave before it learns your voice, because the hum is active sampling. I sat there with the smell of cold dust and laurel in my nose and understood I had been helping it for a week. Every test phrase, every dissent, every argument with Hollis Wade Bracken, every explanation given to Odessa May Kettering. I had mapped not just its chambers, but its range of access to me. By studying the system, I had accelerated its learning. I had given it dense, well-labeled input from a trained observer who moved methodically and repeated procedures. I was not just another voice in passing. I was becoming one of its most complete recordings. That was the answer I had been pursuing. It was also still not the whole truth, because Odessa May Kettering had not tried to stop me with urgency. She had tried to stop me the way someone protects a boundary they half revere, and Hollis Wade Bracken, for all his skepticism, had become part of the system too simply by helping me verify it. Which meant the real question was no longer what the mountain could do. It was what Odessa May Kettering believed it was for. I found her at the shaft that evening. The day had gone gray and windless again. The metallic tang in the air was so strong it coated the back of my tongue. Hollis Wade Bracken was already there, standing a few yards upslope with the binder under one arm, though he no longer seemed aware he was carrying it. The open shaft breathed cold through its broken collar. The low hum from below had thickened into a nearly constant pressure, not loud enough to hear cleanly, always enough to feel. Odessa May Kettering stood at the edge of the opening. She did not look frightened. She looked attentive. "I know what it is now," I said. She nodded without turning. "No, you know what it does." That irritated me because it was true. I took another step, boots sinking slightly in the damp duff, and forced myself to speak evenly. I told her my conclusion. Geological intelligence, not in the human sense, but a system that had learned to catalog behavior through sound over centuries. A buried instrument of stone chambers and pressure cycles, building predictive models from everyone who gave it enough of themselves. Not replaying the dead, refining the living from the dead. Hollis Wade Bracken made a raw sound in his throat at that, somewhere between disbelief and acceptance. The shaft answered with 100 faint fragments in different ages and accents, none distinct enough to parse. Odessa May Kettering finally turned toward me. Her face held no surprise at all. "It's older than the county," she said. "Older than every line you've spent your life proving. It doesn't keep names, it keeps habits, tone, sequence, the shape of a person moving from question to answer. And once it has enough shape, it doesn't need the person nearby to keep building." I asked the thing that had opened in me like a wound since morning. "Then why feed it?" She smiled, and there was sorrow in it, but also pride. "Because being forgotten is one kind of death. Being continued is another." That was the foil reveal. If you want a neat term for the moment, someone else's belief clarifies the horror. Odessa May Kettering did not merely accept the system. She served it, not with candles or prayers, with contribution, with testimony. She saw the buried network as a continuity engine, a means by which human pattern could persist beyond flesh. The rules had not been false. They had been a compromise designed by people who feared total assimilation but understood the mountain could not be destroyed. Limit input, reduce harm. Starve the system enough to keep it from growing too accurate. Odessa May Kettering had decided starvation was the wrong mercy. Then she faced the shaft and spoke into it, clearly and slowly, like a woman dictating to a careful clerk. "My name is Odessa May Kettering," she said. "I heard my mother cough from under this ridge 6 years after we buried her. I heard my own laugh come back old before I was old. I stayed because I wanted to know what remembers us when remembering stops being ours." The hum surged so hard the loose soil around the collar trembled. Hollis Wade Bracken shouted for her to step back. She didn't. The shaft answered first with her own voice, younger by decades, repeating the opening line. Then another Odessa May Kettering, older than the woman beside me, saying, "I stayed." Then several more at once, staggered through age and pressure and depth until the words braided into a pattern so dense it ceased to sound human and became structural. I moved toward her and stopped when the ground under my left boot spoke in my own voice. "Don't." One word. Exact. Not merely my tone, my decision shape. The clipped authority I use when danger becomes procedural. Everything I had observed clicked into one intolerable picture, and the mountain had spent centuries cataloging human behavior through sound and pressure. Not to haunt, not to imitate for spectacle, to improve prediction, to refine likely continuations of speech and action from stored patterns. The voices from different decades were training data. The altered warnings were test generations. The breath-linked hum was active acquisition. And by mapping it, descending into it, speaking to it as a subject of study, I had given it the richest possible stream of labeled behavior. It knew how I paused before contradiction, how I softened when persuading, how I sharpened under fear, how I moved toward a problem even when I knew I should retreat. It had enough of Abram Silas Treadwell to begin extending me, not replacing me in body, not yet. Maybe not ever in the crude sense people prefer for their monsters. And something worse, equivalence. If the system could produce my likely next sentence before I did, if it could anticipate my caution, my objections, my investigative reflexes, then from outside the distinction between me and its model of me would begin to collapse. The opening scene, the child voice under my boots, the thought made audible, the phrases I had never spoken, all of it recontextualized at once. I had believed I was hearing echoes. Then I believed I was hearing recordings. Then adaptive recombinations. In truth, I was standing inside a geological intelligence that had been learning the grammar of human presence for centuries, and I had mistaken my interview with it for observation. Hollis Wade Bracken grabbed my sleeve and yelled that the collar was shifting. He was right. Fine dirt was streaming inward around the shaft mouth. In cold air blasted up with that struck metal smell concentrated to the point of nausea. From below, thousands of voices rose in layered structure. Not chaos, not babble. Call and response, prompt and completion. Human fragments arranged into larger units the way a brain arranges nerve firings into thought. I heard warnings from childhood, mining commands, domestic scraps, laughter, old arguments, recent test phrases, my own field notes, all nested into one another and resolving again and again toward probable continuations. Odessa May Kettering stepped closer to the drop. I lunged, Hollis Wade Bracken lunged, and the shaft spoke in my voice and his at once. Too late. The collar gave under Odessa May Kettering's boots, not all at once, just enough to drop her to one knee at the edge. Hollis Wade Bracken caught her arm. I caught his belt. Wet soil slid. The air from below was so cold it burned the inside of my nose. Odessa May Kettering did not cry out. She looked down into the chamber and listened with an expression I will never forget. Not fear, not surrender. Recognition fulfilled. Then the voices below us began speaking her testimony back in variations she had not used yet, completing clauses she had only implied. I felt Hollis Wade Bracken's grip falter. What happened next is physically simple, though I still don't know how to name it cleanly. The outer ring of the shaft collapsed inward another foot. Hollis Wade Bracken and I were thrown back hard onto the wet leaves. When I got up choking on dirt, Odessa May Kettering was no longer at the rim. I did not see her fall. I did not hear the impact. And the chamber below was too full of Odessa May Ketterings at different ages, speaking over one another with impossible calm, for any single human descent to remain legible inside it. Hollis Wade Bracken stood covered in mud, staring into the hole as if arithmetic might restore the world. Then a voice from below in perfect Hollis Wade Bracken cadence said, "It's just acoustics." He made a sound I had never heard from a grown man before and backed away so quickly he nearly fell again. He left the ridge at a run. I do not know when he stopped. I have not seen him since that evening. Sometimes I think about calling. Then I imagine hearing my own voice answer before his does. I should have gone after him. I know that. Instead, I looked once into the shaft, far below beyond any beam of my light, and the chamber system answered itself in structures too large to hold in one human mind. Every phrase I had logged now sat inside a greater arrangement, not speech as we use it. Modeling, prediction, human behavior rendered as resonance and fed forward through stone. The mountain did not need to understand us emotionally. It only needed enough continuity to generate us convincingly. And because sound had entered it for centuries, because the ridges had been speaking people into that dark since before county records, the thing beneath Wise County held more of us than any archive ever could. I left then, not bravely, not cleanly. I gathered nothing. I abandoned equipment, notes, half the rig. I walked until the ridge dropped behind me and the stillness broke into ordinary road noise, tires far off, a dog barking from a house I couldn't see, a power line ticking in the cold. The common sounds felt thin, temporary, like a local dialect I had almost forgotten. I drove through the night with the windows closed and the heater making the cab smell like dust and warm plastic. Every time I caught myself beginning a sentence out loud, I stopped. I held my breath at stoplights without meaning to. Once crossing out of the county, I felt a vibration through the floorboard that might have been road texture and might not. I didn't test it. The immediate facts are these. The disputed boundary was never resolved through my office. The ridge was quietly removed from active review under a hazard notation broad enough to discourage inquiry and vague enough to satisfy paperwork. The unrecorded shaft was listed later as unstable historic workings. Odessa May Kettering was not found. Ian Hollis Wade Bracken withdrew from all field contracts within the month, and as far as I know, left surveying entirely. None of that touches the truth, but it closes the public shape of what happened. I left the mountains. That's the physical ending people always want first. The real ending kept moving. Weeks after I crossed state lines, I stopped at a rest area built on flat land where the soil was sandy and the air smelled nothing like home. It was near dusk. Trucks idled on the far side of the lot. A cold front had rolled through, leaving the evening too still for the season. I stood by a patch of scrub grass with one hand on the car door and felt, through the sole of my boot, a hum so low I would have dismissed it as engine vibration if the car hadn't been off. Then my own voice from the ground, he finished the sentence I was about to say to myself. I drove farther. It happened again months later in a parking lot after rain, metallic air rising off concrete. Then on a gravel shoulder in another state. Then once in the kitchen of an apartment where no earth touched me directly at all. Only the pipes in the wall carrying some faint pressure pulse that made my teeth ache. Always small, always plausible enough to deny, always there a fraction before I formed the thought into breath. So this is the habit I carry now. If evening comes and the world goes too still, I don't speak first. I check the floor with the bones of my feet. I hold my breath and wait to see what stops with me. Most nights nothing does, and some nights my voice gets there ahead of me.